Today, we're jumping into the U.S. presidential election of 1872.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
It really is. What drew me in was just how much it seems to, well, highlight the big changes and, frankly, the deep divisions in America right after the Civil War,
Yeah,
and maybe some surprising echoes of today.
absolutely. And to really unpack it, we've looked at quite a few sources. We've got the Wikipedia pages on the election,
Yeah.
the Liberal Republican Party, which is a story in itself, the Panic of 1873, and Grant's administration scandals.
Okay.
Plus an article from the American Presidency Project detailing the Liberal Republican platform, something from Texas Public Radio on what lessons we might draw today, and quite a moving piece from Smithsonian Magazine about Horace Greeley's final days.
So our mission here is, to get past just the names and dates of 1872. We want to understand the forces at play, the core issues, the whole atmosphere, and maybe find those connections to now.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's set the scene. What was the state of the U.S. as this election cycle started?
Well, the big context, no question, is Reconstruction. The country's still figuring out how to put itself back together after the Civil War, reintegrating the South.
Not easy.
Not at all. And a huge part of that was the status of formerly enslaved people, citizenship, rights. The federal government's trying to enforce these things, but there's massive resistance, especially down south. So yeah, deep fault lines still existed.
And it wasn't just North versus South, right? There was also some growing unease about the federal government itself.
Exactly. President Grant, the war hero, well, his administration was increasingly getting hit with accusations of corruption, lots of them. So you start hearing this call for civil service reform. People wanted to move away from the spoil system, handing out jobs to political pals and towards something based on merit. That desire for a cleaner government was definitely building.
Which leads us straight to this new political group popping up, the Liberal Republican Party. Why did they form? What was driving them?
It really grew out of that dissatisfaction with Grant specifically, and also with the policies of the Radical Republicans.
Okay, and Radical Republicans meaning?
That was the faction that really wanted a strong federal hand in Reconstruction, pushing hard for Black civil rights in the South. The Liberal Republicans, though, they felt Reconstruction had gone on too long, that the federal government was maybe overstepping.
Right.
Plus, they shared that concern about corruption and wanted that civil service reform. Their big message was basically, less federal power and Reconstruction, withdraw the troops, and let's try to reconcile North and South.
A pretty significant break from the main Republican Party line. Who were the early figures associated with this movement?
Well, initially, there were some prominent names floated. People like David Davis, a Supreme Court justice, Senator Lyman Trumbull, Charles Francis Adams. He had a strong diplomatic background. Established figures who were unhappy with Grant for various reasons.
But the nomination didn't go to any of them. It went to Horace Greeley, a newspaper guy. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing, isn't it? It really shows the power of the press back then. Adams might have fit the reformist mold better ideologically, but Greeley, he was the editor of the New York Tribune for ages. Hugely influential. Everyone knew his name.
Okay.
So even though there were debates, like his support for high tariffs didn't quite mesh with the free trade ideas some liberal Republicans had, his visibility, his loud criticisms of Grant, it won him the nomination. The thinking was maybe, just maybe, he was the one who could actually beat Grant.
And then things got even stranger because this new party teamed up with, well, their old rivals.
Right, the Democratic Party. They were desperate to get Grant out. So they made this strategic calculation and endorsed the liberal Republican ticket, Greeley for president, Benjamin Gratz Brown for VP.
A real marriage of convenience.
Totally. I mean, many Democrats probably weren't huge Greeley fans personally, given his history of criticizing them in his paper, but defeating Grant was the priority. So they adopted the liberal Republican platform, basically creating this fusion ticket. It was their shot at getting back into power.
So the stage is set. Grant, the incumbent war hero, but with this shadow of scandal versus Greeley, the famous editor leading this odd coalition. How did the campaign itself play out? What were Grant's strengths?
Well, Grant still had that powerful image as the general who won the Civil War. That resonated. And crucially, he had money, a lot more money than Greeley. Big donations from guys like Jay Cooke, Vanderbilt, Astor.
The big industrialists.
Exactly. That let them run a much bigger, more visible campaign.
And Greeley. What were his weaknesses besides being new to running for office? Did his newspaper past come back to bite him?
Oh, absolutely. Decades of writing editorials meant decades of opinions, sometimes controversial ones, sometimes contradictory ones. His opponents had a field day digging all that up.
I bet.
Plus, he just didn't have political experience in the same way. The campaign sometimes seemed, well, a bit disorganized. There was that famous line going around, "Why turn out a knave just to replace him with a fool?" That kind of summed up the skepticism some people had.
Ouch. Sounds like it got nasty. Was there much focus on actual policy, or was it mostly personal attacks?
Unfortunately, it leaned heavily towards the personal. Lots of mudslinging on both sides really overshadowed the policy debates. Grant and Greeley both faced intense, often unfair criticism. Greeley's past political shifts, for instance, were used to undercut his own attacks on Grant's administration.
So those core liberal Republican ideas, civil service reform, ending Reconstruction, how much did Greeley actually campaign on those?
It's interesting. While reform was the spark for many founders, Greeley on the trail seemed to focus more on reconciliation, ending radical Reconstruction, as they called it, taking a softer line on the South.
Yeah.
But his support for protectionist tariffs, that stayed consistent, even though it wasn't really a core liberal Republican thing initially and probably caused some friction within the coalition.
And how did the Grant campaign push back against this call to change Reconstruction?
They really played the patriotism card, waved the bloody shirt, as they said. They appealed to Union veterans, basically arguing that the liberal Republicans wanted to undo the results of the Civil War, let the South off too easy, maybe even risk Confederate influence returning.
Framing it as protecting the victory.
Pretty much. Preserving the Union versus going backward.
Fascinating dynamics.
Wait.
What about African-American voters who were newly enfranchised in many places? Did both sides try to win their support?
They both made efforts, yeah, but with different approaches. The liberal Republicans pointed to Greeley's long record as an abolitionist editor.
Hoping that would appeal.
Right. But Frederick Douglass, a really key figure in the Black community, came out strongly for Grant and the main Republican Party. He likely saw them as the safer bet for protecting Black civil rights, especially with all the resistance in the South. Douglass actively campaigned for Grant. It shows how complex the choices were.
And this election was also a landmark moment for women's suffrage, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. This was really the first presidential election after the big suffrage groups, the National Woman Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association, had formed in 1869. So activism was ramping up.
And we actually had the first woman run for president. Tell us about Victoria Woodhull.
That's right, Victoria Woodhull. Nominated by the Equal Rights Party, which was pushing for, well, equal rights for everyone. They even nominated Frederick Douglass for VP alongside her, though, as we said, he didn't really engage with that nomination.
So Woodhull campaigned.
She did, mostly around New York, gave speeches, argued passionately for suffrage, but her campaign had very, very little money. A huge challenge.
And then something dramatic happened right before the vote.
Yes, quite dramatic. Just days before the election, she was arrested. The charges were obscenity related to her newspaper. Most people saw it as politically motivated.
Wow, so she couldn't even vote for herself.
Exactly. And technically speaking, even without the arrest, she wasn't actually old enough to be president, yet she wouldn't turn 35 until the next year. In the end, the Woodhull-Douglas ticket got almost no votes, no electoral vote.
But still a significant moment. And Susan B. Anthony was involved, too.
Yes, famously. She led a group of women who tried to vote in Rochester, New York, got arrested for it. Her trial the next year, the fine she refused to pay it, became a huge symbol for the suffrage movement, really brought national attention to the cause.
So despite all these undercurrents and challenges, the election result itself was.
Grant won. He was reelected.
Did Greeley manage to win any states at all?
He did, yes. He carried 6 states: Texas, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and Maryland. Mostly southern and border states, which maybe suggests his message about ending Reconstruction resonated there to some degree.
But there's a really strange and sad twist involving Greeley after the election.
It's incredibly unusual. Horace Greeley actually died in late November 1872. That was after the popular vote, but before the Electoral College met to cast its votes.
So what happened to his electoral votes?
It created a bit of a mess. His electors couldn't vote for a deceased candidate, so they ended up scattering their votes. Most went to Thomas Hendricks, some to Greeley's running mate, Benjamin Gratz Brown, a few others too. Congress later decided not to even count the 3 votes that were cast for Greeley posthumously. Just a bizarre end.
Truly strange. Now, we mentioned the backdrop of corruption concerns. Can you give us a bit more detail on the kinds of scandals swirling around Grant's administration?
Yeah, that perception of corruption was a major factor fueling the whole liberal Republican push. A really big one, though it blew up fully after 1872, was the whiskey ring scandal in 1875.
Okay, what was that?
It was this huge scheme, whiskey distillers bribing Treasury officials to avoid paying federal taxes, millions of dollars lost to the government, and the really damaging part, President Grant's own private secretary, Orville Babcock, got caught up in it. That really hurt public trust.
Wow. And wasn't there something called the salary grab, too?
Yes, in 1873, Congress voted themselves, the president, and other officials a big pay raise. But the part that really got people furious was that they made the congressional raise retroactive, a $5,000 bonus for the past 2 years.
People must have been outraged.
Oh, hugely. Newspapers hammered them. The public outcry was so strong that Congress actually repealed their own raise, though the president stayed. It just added to this feeling of, politicians looking out for themselves.
It really paints a picture of a volatile time. And then, as if political turmoil wasn't enough, the economy took a nosedive.
Exactly. The panic of 1873 hit that September. It wasn't just a blip. It kicked off a really long, deep economic depression.
What caused it?
A mix of things, really. Too much speculation, especially in railroads. They were expanding like crazy. Then Germany and the U.S. both moved away from silver as currency, which caused monetary ripples. Add in some economic instability in Europe after the Franco-Prussian War, plus big losses from things like the Great Chicago Fire. It was a perfect storm.
And wasn't there a connection to one of Grant's major financial backers?
Yes, that was the trigger, really. J. Cook and Company, a huge banking firm, they'd funded Grant's campaign, heavily invested in the Northern Pacific Railroad, and they collapsed.
And that started a chain reaction.
It did. Bank runs, other banks failing, the New York Stock Exchange had to close temporarily, credit just dried up.
What did that mean for everyday people?
It was devastating. Businesses failed, massive unemployment, hardship lasted for years, and it had political consequences too. The Republicans took a beating in the 1874 midterms, lost the House, and all that economic pain definitely weakened public appetite for spending money on Reconstruction in the South.
It's always striking how economics and politics are so intertwined.
Yeah.
Looking back at 1872 from today, it's hard not to see some parallels, right?
It really is. That Texas Public Radio piece we looked at draws some direct lines. The intense political polarization back then, debates over race, voting rights, we're still grappling with versions of those today.
Yeah.
And think about the accusations of election issues, political violence, especially in the South. Sadly, those have echoes too. Plus, the power of the media, how rhetoric shapes opinion, the spread of misinformation that feels incredibly relevant now just with different technology. It makes you wonder, how much the basic dynamics have really changed.
It's a pretty sobering thought. Let's end by circling back to Horace Greeley.
Yeah.
His personal story. After that tough election. It's quite tragic.
It really is. The Smithsonian Magazine article suggests his health just plummeted during the campaign. The stress, the attacks, the sheer exhaustion.
Yeah.
Historians think his symptoms, anxiety, depression, insomnia, lined up with what they called neurasthenia back then, basically nervous exhaustion from overwork. And less than a month after losing the election, he died in a sanatorium. Just a really stark reminder of the human cost of these intense political fights.
A dramatic and, heartbreaking end. So, wrapping up our deep dive on 1872.
Well, we've covered a really complex moment. You've got the aftermath of the Civil War, these reform movements trying to tackle corruption, the first real pushes for women's suffrage, the scandals, this looming economic crisis. It all converged.
And the election itself, this weird coalition, the focus on personality, It shows a nation really struggling with big changes and deep divisions.
That's like
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How those challenges, the polarization, the questions about fairness and corruption, the impact of economic trouble, how they still resonate today. What can we learn from looking back at 1872 as we deal with our own complicated times? It definitely makes you want to dig deeper into Reconstruction and everything that shaped that era, and maybe still shapes ours.